good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you are in. My name is Isaac Schloss. For those who don't know me, I am the Chief Product Officer here at Contact Center Compliance, often better known as DNC.com. If you are unfamiliar with us and you are new to us and this is your first time interacting with us, let me tell you a little bit about us real quick. We partner with our customers in complying with the many regulations regarding customer member outreach. This includes scrubbing your records against any applicable do not call list, state, federal, things like that, looking for number reassignments, weeding out professional plaintiffs that might be hiding in your list, waiting for you to call so they can generate a lawsuit against you. We can help with all of those. Once your lists are nice and clean and everything is good to go from a calling perspective, we can help you get a higher deliverability rate by removing errant spam tags. This is not a get out of jail free card for spammers, but for good actors who have been mislabeled, we can help you with that. We also provide call branding services, which will be something we'll talk about quite a bit on the call today. Again, we try to help you maximize delivery of your calls through a lot of those services, making sure that you're only calling people that you should be calling, you want to be calling, and that your leads are having the best possible chance of getting through. Now, a couple quick housekeeping notes before I introduce my speakers. There is a Q&A tab where the viewers can post questions or comments. We are going to do our very best to address all those questions during the call, but a lot of times we run out of time, so if that happens, we will get back with you just as soon as possible. If there's somebody specific you would like to answer your question, feel free to make that a part of your question. Just say, hey, Aaron, hey, Joe, hey, Isaac, hey, whoever. But just note, if you do post your questions anonymously, if we don't have time to get to them on this webinar, we will not have time to get to them at all because we won't know who to get to. So please make sure you post that information. We will not reveal any names on this call. And just a final housekeeping note here, while our speakers are often, and today our guest speakers most definitely are attorneys, every business is very different, and the information that we're sharing here today should not be taken as legal advice. So before you make any changes to policy, before you act on anything we talk about today, talk to your compliance team, talk to qualified counsel. If you don't have an attorney that you work with that specializes in TCPA specifically, I have a couple recommendations, that may be on this webinar today, and give you somebody you could talk to. And all that said, let's talk to the people who would be on that recommendation list, very high up, in fact, in alphabetical order. I will start with Mr. Aaron Perry. I go first name, not last name, because I'm an S, and that's no fair. So Aaron is an associate at McMurray Schuster. If you've been to our webinars before, I'm sure you've seen him several times. He's a regular speaker at our events. We love having him, and there is his contact information dropped into the chat room. There's a full bio of him up on our website. We'll tell you about that later. So if you want to learn more about his impressive background, please feel free to check in. We've also got Joe Bowser with us today, who's a partner at Roth Jackson. Joe is a newer member of our speaking circuit, but this is probably his second or third webinar that we have hosted. I've done a few with him outside of Contact Center Compliance. He will be speaking at his second of our events this December, so very excited to have you here. So, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is, obviously, if you've been following the news, there's been a couple big stories. One of them has been the government is shut down. That is looking like it's going to end in a few hours. I don't think that we've had the official vote yet that we need to finalize that, but that is in play. And while most of the government has been shut down and flights have been delayed and there have been all kinds of other headaches that have been caused, one thing that did not slow down is the FCC, at least not when it comes to rulemaking. And they had an open meeting last month where they discussed they announced, among other things, that they want to solicit feedback from the industry on some rule changes. And what they released, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was like a 46-page filing or a letter, something like that. I can't remember the exact link, but I spent an afternoon reading it. And I was on a call earlier with Aaron. We're both members of IMC. This came up on that call, and Aaron made the comment he recommends everybody reads it. So my team will put a link to it in the chat. Just showed up there. Recommend you do the same. But this is for an NPRM, which NPRM is a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and it's just that. It's a notice of a proposed rulemaking. It's not a notice that they've made the rule or that this is definitely what's going to happen. Part of the process with the FCC making changes to the TCPA, and other agencies have to go through a similar process, is they have to say, hey, we're thinking about making a change. Anybody that wants to say something, now is your time to do it. There's a process for filing comments. I won't go into detail on that. If you're not familiar with that, again, I recommend you get with an attorney to help you draft those comments. But we are, they tell you what they're thinking, why they're thinking, what they're looking to do. And in this call, what we want to do is we want to dive into what was discussed, what they're looking at doing, and just, again, give opportunity to discuss this and to see where everybody lies. So in the NPRM, it's funny, we were talking yesterday, the speakers and I, about how we would go through this. And I'm just going to very quickly do a screen share of the rulemaking proposal. And if you see on your screens here, I am all the way on page, what is this, 36 right now of 46. And this is where they talk about what they're actually changing. So the preceding 35 pages were their general thoughts behind it. But these are specific references to the things that they are looking to change. And right off the bat, we are seeing changes potentially to the TCPA. And they're talking about things like, hey, let's remove these sections. Let's remove these sections. So I'd like to start and talk about what some of these removals are, what that could mean to the industry, and take some questions from the group on what their thoughts are and where they'd like to see that go. So starting with the 64-1200 section, 6 and 7, these are related to, I know one's related to call abandonment, right? Aaron, since you were first alphabetically, why don't you take the first shot at 6 and 7? Kind of summarize what's being removed there.
Yes, so right out of the gate, these do the proposals do want to eliminate what the FCC is called outdated call abandonment rules, and the rules prohibit disconnecting unanswered calls before 15 seconds or 4 rings, and then the rule also limits abandoned calls to 3% of total telemarketing calls. The issue here is while this may be unnecessary in FCC world, there are comparable rules in FTC world. Remember, the FTC is the agency that enforces the TSR. And in the TSR, there's actually kind of slightly more onerous rules. So, for example, the TCPA's call abandonment prohibits abandoning more than 3% of telemarketing calls. The TSR prohibits abandoning any outbound telephone call. So while this first rule isn't necessarily a complete elimination where it'll wipe out any compliance obligations, it just removes these provisions from the TCPA regulations. The TSR regulations will still remain.
Now that's interesting because and I'll be the first to admit this, I wasn't aware the TSR didn't have similar provisions on call abandonment. So it's 0%, or is that where it falls into when you abandon? So an abandoned call, again, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it's funny. I've been in call centers for 25 years, so call abandonment was just a thing you did for fun back in 1999, and that all changed around 2003. But and I'd be somewhat hyperbolic there, but it's essentially you try to dial leads so quickly so that if you're a call center manager, you want the situation to be your agent is on the phone and they hang up with the customer and then they've got the next customer on the phone. And in a utopian world, that's how it's going to be, or they only have a few seconds between calls. The problem with that, obviously, is that your dialer then has to predict, and this is predictive dialing, how many calls it has to dial at a time to give you that steady flow of calls. It's a prediction. It's not a science. Therefore, it's going to over dial sometimes, and a call is going to get answered, and there's no one to send the call to. So back in the day, it used to be, well, they would just hold that call until somebody's available, or they play some music to them, or something like that. And then around 2003, I want to say, because I remember when it happened, a law came out that said, okay, what you got to do is you've got 2 seconds maximum, and then you have to play them a message. And in that message, you have to tell them who you are, why you're calling, and what number they can call you back on to get put on Do Not Call list, and then you have to hang up. And then much later, it morphed into you also have to give them an option to press a button in that, I think it was like 2015, press a button to be put on the Do Not Call list right then and there. So there's nothing in the TSR that even allows for that.
Well, for some of those, like the key press option for pre-recorded messages, that is in the TSR, but the precise rule does not have that 3% requirement. And
Ah,
and so, practically speaking, I mean, that the TSR does not have a private right of action. It is solely regulator enforced. So, there is less risk for businesses that have to worry about complying with the abandoned call requirement. But I mean, at the end of the day, dead air it contributes vastly to a negative consumer experience. And with the types of dialers available today, many that are AI driven now, it seems like the FTC or the FCC is thinking, okay, there's really not an incentive to abandon a call if if we do have callers that are abandoning large amounts of calls. They're probably the illegal callers to begin with that are not complying with any telemarketing rules. And the end of the day, if our systems aren't minimizing abandoned calls, the consumer experience is going to suffer.
And it's essentially the subject of zero litigation because one called party has no idea what your call abandonment rate is with respect to all their other calls. So there's really just not a meaningful enforcement mechanism. And as Aaron noted, the FTC is well placed to enforce the TSR against particularly bad actors.
now is this, Joe, in your opinion, is this one of those sections that is open to interpretation as to whether or not private right of action, even under the TCPA, applies to this? Or is this one of those sections where it's cut and dry that this is currently protected by private right of action?
No, I don't think it's cut and dry that it's protected by private right of action. So there is, not to quibble with Aaron, there is a private right of action in the TSR. You just need to have $50,000 in actual damages, which is why we don't see those cases, right? Because like somebody didn't pick up the phone or didn't answer the call. Like, what are your damages, right?
Right.
So anyways, so for outlier cases, you can sue under the TSR, but those are seldom brought, right? But for the 2003 order that you're talking about, that was implemented pursuant to the 2003 Do Not Call Implementation Act, right? And so it's not necessarily a 227B issue, and it's certainly not a 227C issue because 227C cabined the FCC's statutory authority to act within 9 months of the TCPA's enactment in 1991, which is why the 2003 DNC Implementation Act even needed to be enacted in the first place.
Right. Yes,
so,
and
so,
I
so
remember
227C5's private right of action has to be for a violation of a regulation promulgated under this subsection. And these things from 2003, you just need a timeline, right? 2003 happened well after 1992, so therefore it wasn't promulgated under the TCPA.
And for those of you who heard that and said, okay, can we play that back in slow motion? That's why you need qualified counsel representing you when you're up against these things, because there's nuance like that you have to think about. I mean, I heard that, I'm like, oh yeah, wow, that's brilliant. I never even thought about it from that perspective before, but I deal with this every single day. This is the exact type of thing that you need behind you when you get faced with this. Because I look at this and it's like, okay, well, when you made the comment about, well, you don't know how many people were affected by that. How often do we see plaintiffs go fishing during discovery where they try to build a class by they call for discovery of an entire calling list, and suddenly they find, oh wow, there's 3,000 violations. Now I've got my class or something like that. So it does become scary. Now, I will say that, and we did get one in the Q&A who even said, can you say that again? There will be a replay, by the way, for anybody who's watching, and for some of the more complicated parts, you can watch it in slow speed. When I'm talking, you might want to speed it up to skip past it. But
I'll try to go in 0.5 mode.
Okay, there you go. No, but it's brilliant because I mean, it was what you said is just. I mean, it's very key to how you have to look at some of this implementation and what the real effect of this is. Now, I will say from personal experience, in 2003, I was representing really big brands. I'm not going to name names here, but common household names you would also know today. And we would typically dial 10% abandon rate. If it was a political campaign, maybe we'd be good going all the way up to a 50% abandon rate. And to understand what an abandon rate is, this is based on not the number of calls you dial, but the number of calls that get answered by a real person. So in simplest terms, if I'm looking at a 3% cap on abandon, that means if I dial 1,000 people and 100 answer, I can abandon 3 calls and be within the legal limit. That is tight. That is really tight. So you have the AI algorithms made it better, maybe, maybe not. I think that, when this happened, I remember the day this went into effect, we immediately went from 10% to 3%, like that. We didn't push the envelope at all. But the company I worked for was a self-purported, good actor. So if the law changes, we do what the law says. Would rolling this back change any practices? I don't know, but it's definitely something that's interesting to consider. I'd like to move on, though, and Joe, I'm going to put this one now over to you, and we're just going to go down a couple of lines, and the next provision I think is even more interesting potentially, and this is 10. So let's talk about 10.
Yeah, so 10 is the one that the FCC recently changed its consent revocation rule to allow consumers to opt out via any reasonable method. Everybody hopefully knows that the revocation rules, when a consumer revokes consent with respect to one type of message, like an informational message, and doesn't respond to a one-time clarification message, asking for clarification about whether they really don't want to get, for example, fraud alerts, we now are expected to, starting in April of 26, treat that as a global opt-out. So the FCC clearly is listening to industry and saying there will be real consumer harms. And if whoever's interested, go to footnote 123 in that document, which I can only remember because it is 123. But there it seems pretty clear that if the FCC doesn't announce these rules, finalize this rulemaking proceeding by April of 26, the Commission's Bureau is going to take action with respect to that rule, which a lot of people are paying attention to for good reason, because there's already an uptick in reasonable method DNC revocation cases through the artful dodgers who conspicuously avoid texting stop or quit or end or something clear. So basically, the FCC is rescinding the Biden era any reasonable method consent revocation rule, and will essentially go back to the default regime we were in before that new rule was announced a few years ago, 2, 3. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think that this is interesting because we've already seen that some people are kind of testing the water with some of the just special words, the magic words or the lack of magic words with opt-out. So I think that obviously this takes it into a different direction as well when we're talking about the type of consent that's being removed or the communication. Aaron, anything else you want to jump in on this one with?
Well, I think a lot of the new or the rule that took effect earlier in the spring had kind of been around already. It was just codified finally. So no matter what happens here with the A10 revocation rules, it's still going to be imperative to consider to break down A10 completely and see what had already existed from a prior FCC ruling. The accept opt-outs through any reasonable means requirement that first surfaced in a 2015 ruling. So I think that even if this goes away completely, is changed, there's still some linking that we'll have to do to figure out what position has the FCC already taken. Now we can get into whether the FCC's interpretation is going to hold up, and we had some helpful cases just recently that could help bolster arguments for that. But it's just a reminder that some portions of this A10 rule have been around through previous rulings.
Right. And it's worth remembering that the A10 rule, like read strictly, are really around prior express consent and prior express written consent, which are 227B ideas, right? So 227B regulates auto dialers, pre-recorded and artificial voice. So, their application to the DNC rules is, not obvious. Even though they're talking about opting out of SMS, and hopefully nobody's sending SMS with an auto dialer because that code shouldn't be in the platform to begin with, right?
Right.
So, yes, so that's that's what's proposed to be removed. And I think the commission's right that it's creating unnecessary confusion for consumers. But needless to say, the plaintiffs bar and NCLC and those types, they're going to be submitting comments advocating for the retention of this rule for sure.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think is critical for everybody to keep in mind, both here and as we get into the next section, is that we typically see two sides to a lot of these arguments. We see people that have a vested interest in things staying the way they are because they can monetize that, or things going a different direction because they can monetize that, especially if you step over the line or it's going to require some new technology, it's going to drive more business to them, versus you'll have people that are typically more on the call center side. They're like, hey, listen, I don't want this to, hit me. And it's hard on the call center side sometimes, because on some of these, it's like a 3% abandon rate, where you're like, oh, well, gee, I don't want you to get rid of that rule because, I want to dial 10%. That's not going to win you a whole lot of arguments if that's your side of it. But there are ways to make a reasonable argument that shows support for moving the regulation without painting yourself as a bad actor. But again, this is where you need to join with others to see what those general comments are. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, because the next change, I'm just going to cover that really quickly and move on, because I want to move into the meat and potatoes of this. The next requirement, or the next thing they're talking about changing, is just there's a provision where you leave a message and you have to give them a phone number they can call you back on, and they go into detail to say it can't be a 1-900 number. I would imagine a lot of people in the audience don't even know what a 900 number is. But there's some provisions where you have to have a toll-free number that exists. I mean, there's a lot of rules behind it, and the FCC is just kind of looking at it and saying, hey, modern calling, modern usage of phones, barely anybody pays for long distance calls anymore. Right now, people are just primarily just saying, hey, I get 1 million minutes a month and I can use them however I want. Or more commonly, I've got an unlimited plan. So they see that as being a little bit more prescriptive and onerous than it needs to be. So looking to just simplify that language to where you're just clearly stating the telephone number, and that they can call that business back, and just not put a lot of restrictions or requirements around what that phone number needs to look like. I think obviously it'll need to be a U.S. number, so this is the kind of thing where be careful not to try to exploit it and say, oh, I'm going to put a phone number in, Tanzania or something like that, and now it's 50 cents a minute to make a phone call. But I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that, or we can move on to Section K.
Yeah, that one's part of A7 that's getting cut. So
yeah,
that one would go, I think.
I think so.
Interestingly, so the Appendix A that you showed, Isaac, they've got some sections that they say they're going to remove and reserve, but then it's not actually listed. So I don't know if that was just some careless drafting in the subpart L description there on the Appendix A. But anyways, I don't know. I don't know if they rushed this one out the door. Obviously, they issued a pre-release on this one before the meeting, but there's a couple of other subsections of the TCPA that they're proposing to cut that aren't listed in the 64-1200 section of remove and reserve. None of them are surprising because they marry up with the ones we've already talked about. But anyways, just flagging that for anyone who is going to submit comments.
Right, and that's the key, is the comments are the key, because they're going to take that and they're going to use that. Whatever's in here is what they're looking to go after. The devil will be in the details of what they draft as the final rule. So that's where they'll need guidance. And hey, the government was shut down, so they probably didn't have their full attorneys working with them to try to draft this. I'm not sure. Before we move on, though, there was a question. Somebody wants just a sanity check on what I said, and I love that because I don't care who you're talking to, especially if they're not your attorney. Don't just take their word for anything they say about compliance. Fact check it. So somebody wanted to just pull and say, hey, just double checking. Basically, Isaac said that abandonment is based on the actual the calls answered, but this person had always been told it was based on dials. What is your guys' thoughts on that? For determining a call abandonment rate? Is it based on calls dialed or calls answered?
The denominator is calls answered by a live person.
Yeah, because the rule says that defines an abandoned call as one where a telemarketer doesn't connect within 2 seconds of the recipient's hello or other whatever greeting. So it incorporates that the recipient has to answer it in order for it to be abandoned. And if we think of what the target is here, is that dead air between when the recipient answers and when the caller starts their greeting.
100%. Yeah, the rule says you can't abandon more than 3% of all telemarketing calls. So your political stuff was fine to begin with, Isaac. Telemarketing calls that are answered live by a person. So you cut out unanswered, you cut out AMD, right? You got to get a human, which is why you can never get a class certified. Because what are you going to do? Look at CDRs and be like, did Jenny answer? I don't know, right? You got to call Jenny back, right?
Right. Absolutely. And that's where too, there's some philosophies they'll say, well, you got to be careful how you code things, because let's just say somebody did do a CDR analysis, and then they try to tie it to, of the ones that were a connection, how many were answering machine dispositions versus a live person. Realistically speaking, we all need accurate data. So you're not suggesting necessarily changing anything like that, but so we'll move on for that. Also, I did see one person ask a question about the chat being disabled. That is intentional. We don't have chat going in this. We just have the other than your ability to bring it up and see the window. So if you've got questions, just please keep putting them into the Q&A, and we thank you for that. So
I have a boy brain, so I don't read the chat while I talk.
Oh, that's okay. I've got you guys to be smart, so I can just kind of zone out from this and go to that and just try to add what I perceive to be witty comments throughout. I'll let the audience grade me on my success of that. So moving into the meat and potatoes of this, and this is where this is, I think, going to have potentially a larger effect, because some of the stuff we're going to talk about will be carrier responsibilities or carrier regulations, or they can be viewed as that, but there's always some trickle-down effects. Some of these will have a more direct effect than others. But the first one they talk about is they go into Section K, and Section K is talking about a lot of the call analytics that we're all used to, like blocking and labeling and things like that. And so specific provisions they're looking at is, it appears they're saying under Section 1 entirely, they want to remove, and that is a provider may block a call when the subscriber to which the originating number is assigned has requested that calls purporting to originate from the number be blocked because the number is used for inbound calls only. What does that mean? Basically, if you've got a phone number, like our phone number at dnc.com, you're never going to get a call from the dnc.com main number. You're going to get a call from my direct line or one of the salespeople's direct line or Ronnie's direct line, whatever. So theoretically, we could go out and we could register on a list and say, hey, this phone number is never going to generate a caller ID. And then the voice providers need to know, okay, well then if I see a call that's coming in, I need to block that call because people said that they're never going to originate. They don't want that number spoofed. Now, you might scratch your head on that one and say, well, why the heck would they remove that if that sounds like a good thing that protects people from unlawful spoofing? Does anybody want to share why that's being removed?
They've already required carriers to do it.
Yep. It's no longer permissive, it's now mandatory.
Right.
So this
is the way the rule is written with the mays, that indicates permissive. It's confusing to anybody reading it.
They forgot to delete the old one. They made the new one.
Exactly. And I think some of this too comes down to duplicate responsibilities, because I think that this one is the terminating provider side, whereas the other one is the originating provider side. So I think that the newer rule requires the originating provider to block those, and this one provides the receiving one. So I think that they're just making that responsibility clear with just the one side, to where they don't have to do the double duty. So that's not as bad. We get into section 2, though, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting, where they're talking about removing, again, similar rules. And I guess this one may not be it. This is, again, reject numbers that aren't valid in the North American numbering plan or that aren't assigned in North America. Again, they've got that somewhere else. It's dual responsibility. So that's why they're pulling some of that out. The more interesting one, I think, actually is in 3.2, where they're talking about blocking analytics. And there's a provision where, again, we've got a remediation solution. We help people with blocking and labeling. So if your calls are getting mislabeled as spam, you've got, your consent to call, or you've got an EBR or whatever, and you're calling this person and you're making a legal call in a non-harassing fashion, and you're being labeled as a spammer or you're being blocked. The carriers are allowed to do that. And there's a provision that says specifically, a terminating provider may block a voice call without liability under the Communications Act or the Commission's rules where, and they give a list of reasons. And one of those that they're looking to change is number 2, which says those analytics include consideration of caller authentication information where available. They're talking about changing it to consideration of authentication and information that a call originated from outside of the United States, where such information is possible. So essentially they're saying, and this is a big part of the change, is they want to know more about the location of the origination of the call. So that can be a factor in blocking calls.
100%. And sorry to jump in there, Isaac.
No, please.
The most, a critically important part of this is to understand what that without liability means, right? So under the FCC's carrier rules, only terminating carriers have a safe harbor right to block. Originating carriers, gateway providers, and domestic intermediates all theoretically can get sued for unlawful blocking. Like, the FCC has for decades held that it is a violation of the Communications Act to engage in unreasonable call blocking. So this right that exists only in the terminating carriers for safe harbor blocking is important, because it's gonna dovetail with what the FCC is gonna allow terminating providers to do in the rest of these rules in terms of labeling foreign originated calls. So they get to scarlet letter for foreign originated calls and block them with impunity based on reasonable analytics, which the FCC's never defined, examined, just ever said what they need to look at. So it's a black box that is somehow presumptively reasonable.
Absolutely. And we see this all the time as, a company that monitors caller ID, spam labeling and blocking. We'll just wake up one day and the rules of the game have changed. Just in a moment's notice, anything that you could do yesterday, you can't do today, but only on this carrier. This other carrier, it's fine, but this carrier has now decided, for whatever reason, they don't like you. They don't like what you're doing, but they're not going to say why. You got to figure that part out and stop doing it. And there are some.
They might even intercept it and play a recording about their view of the call.
Yes, exactly. That's actually a fascinating topic, and I'm gonna put my marketing team on the spot here. But I published a blog just the other day. We discovered a behavior on the T-Mobile network to where if they are labeling your caller ID as scam likely, if you call that phone number back, you will hear a recording from T-Mobile, and this, you have to be a T-Mobile subscriber to get this, but you'll hear a recording that says, this call has been associated with a scam. You probably don't want to talk to them, so we recommend you hang up. And then you get 5 seconds of dead air, and then they route you. So if there it is right there. There's a blog, you could read more about that. So this really can create an issue with some of the over blocking and over labeling that happens. Now, as you go through the document, you talk about all the different paragraphs. They're all numbered. There's paragraph 70 talks about origination, and this is something that's always troubled me. I was on the FCC's North American Numbering Oversight Committee prior to it being disbanded by the FCC earlier this year. And this was a conversation that came up a lot, was the subject of origination. And the question was often, how often is the origination truly happening overseas versus just the person is overseas and all their equipment is right here in the good old US of A? And it happens a lot more than people think. So paragraph 70 seems to point to origination being where the dial tone is. Dial tone doesn't really exist anymore, but where the call is actually physically being initiated by the equipment and coming onto the phone network, if you will. But I think it would be important to make sure that is clearly determined, because that can make a big difference between, a company that has agents offshore, but is a U.S. company serving the U.S. market, versus a company that is 100% operating outside of the U.S. And if you are operating outside of the U.S. 100%, how does this impact your ability potentially to interact with consumers here in the U.S.? And I would love some comments or some people to pop stuff into the Q&A. Should have set up a poll on this. How many people truly originate their call outside of the U.S. to call someone in the U.S. market? I've always felt like there would still be some rate issues that would make that not so appealing. I've had call centers in the Philippines, India, South Africa. I could name a whole ton of countries. But if I was calling into the U.S., I'd be using a system that was in a U.S. cloud. So it'd be an Azure U.S. instance or an AWS instance, because just that was the most cost effective. But any other general thoughts or comments on that? And because this really starts to get into the identity aspect of the call, where they want to know where the caller is located.
You want to jump in here? I don't.
Yeah, I think without a firm definition, the originate from outside the United States, I think that extends to a call initiated from a network, device, or provider that's outside the United States. So I think it's pretty sweeping and could definitely implicate calls from offshore call centers or foreign businesses that are authorized to use U.S. numbers. I think that could likely be considered foreign originated calls based on the no firm definition in the rulemaking.
And I know that there was one comment too from a very respected source in the industry about this being mobile residential roaming, not necessarily an enterprise implication, or maybe that's an acceptable use case on this. And I think that that's very valid. I think though that the problem that as an enterprise caller, somebody who's been on the receiving end of this, the frivolous lawsuits that get thrown out there and anything that could potentially get you wrapped up into that, or in some sort of enforcement action, or you're just getting inundated with traceback requests when you're just trying to do things responsibly and legally. It's important to make sure that we're definitely defining concerns like this to make sure that they are properly addressed. Yes, we are aware that there are a lot of attacks that come from outside of the United States. But I remember I worked for a company, I won't disclose the name, but I'm sure this is a matter of public record at this point. There was a company that I worked for that had a security breach, and it happened by somebody interacted with, they called in to a support line we supported in a foreign country, and the threat actor had a U.S. voice, U.S. accent. Now, did they really have a U.S. accent, or did they, use some sort of software that, with AI cleaned up their voice to make them sound American? Who knows? But they definitely had a U.S.-based origination point where they got into the system and exploited the network, because the agent just trusts them, because the agent's like, oh, they're an American. They're not going to do anything wrong. And they say they're from our IT department, so it all checks out. Let's give them full access to my computer. It's something to keep in mind that, just because we do get a fair number, a high number of these attacks that come from foreign markets, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because a person is there, the call will genuinely hit the U.S. network from that location. It can very easily hit it from right here in the United States. So, we need to make sure that that's clear. And that goes into a question that's in the chat right now, where somebody's asking the question about, hey, we're primarily inbound in the insurance space, people call us, we don't do a lot of calls to them, but occasionally we do have to do that. And when we do that, we, like all other businesses, are trying to keep our labor costs down. So how is this going to affect us? And as it is currently proposed, I think this will only affect you if you're using a dialer or telephony system that is located in that foreign market. But again, I think that it's incumbent on us to be very clear that if they're going to consider anything like that, we can at least have some sort of exemption for U.S.-based calling systems, or it's clear that the origination, meaning the call hits the public network from another country, not from here. And I still have mixed feelings about that, but is there anything you guys want to add on that before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I invite everybody to, carefully read the proposed rule in 1607 because it's got important limitations. So if you want to, I don't know if you want to pull that up again,
Sure.
Isaac, that Appendix A, but basically what the FCC is proposing to do is to make obligations on originating providers to transmit CNAM, right? Caller name, verified caller name information whenever they give a call an A-level attestation under the Stir-Shaken rules, right? So that's going to be A and B right there in 1607. But the foreign branding in C only applies to gateway providers. But the FCC's rules define gateway provider as a US-based intermediate provider that gets a call directly from a foreign originating or intermediate provider. So I have lots of US-based UCaaS type clients whose customers are overseas using NAMPA resources to make their calls, but they're getting to the UCaaS platform just over the web. So there is no intermediate provider. They're just riding over the public internet. So I can't tell if the FCC intentionally wants a humongous hole in this regime, but it's not making a ton of sense to say only gateway providers have to do the foreign call branding when obviously there are lots of other foreign originated calls whose first interconnection with the PSTN is here in the US. But anyways, so the voice service providers, the originating voice service providers have to give verified caller name. The gateway providers are the ones who have to engage in foreign labeling. And then D just says all the other intermediate carriers in the US need to pass on what they get, which is already the rule today for Stir-Shaken. And then E says, and again, like all of these rules are about what a terminating provider might do. Because if you read this long document, the premise is essentially, well, the terminating providers have been giving these check marks based on A-level attestation calls, and people don't really know what that means, or they shouldn't trust it because there's actually lots of illegal calls. They get the check mark. So if a terminating provider wants to give a check mark, I'm going to insist that the originating providers and the gateway providers do all of this stuff so that the terminating provider can, when it flashes the check mark, also say if a gateway provider tagged the call as foreign originated. But the FCC just got done saying Stir-Shaken has been pretty useless. Like there's a statistic in there. They don't even know if it's reliable, but they give a statistic, I think it was from Numerical, who says 48% of illegal calls get an A-level attestation. So, and then they say, is that true? Right? So shouldn't they know? But anyways, they say that the Stir-Shaken system is producing 48% false positives. And then they're going to say, those people who are producing that regime, we're going to have you do more work, without ever like stopping to think about if they can't get that right, why are they going to get the next thing right?
Exactly. And I think that there is.
Anyways, maybe the government should say shut down a little longer.
Well, I think that there's a lot of other aspects in here where some of the failures in Stir-Shaken 2 can happen because of all the non-IP carriers that still exist out there that get involved in the chain in the middle and the attestation gets dropped. there's a lot of bad actors. I saw when the FCC was shutting down carriers this year, there were several that got shut down in there that were able to do A-level attestations that were known bad guys. Like there was that Prince Anand or whatever his name is that had his open or his one eye
One eye,
owl.
one owl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I saw that on the list. And I'm like, okay, that's one that's getting shut down. Oh yeah, that's really bad. I mean, so but there are bad guys out there. I know that there is a push from the FCC to move more to a full IP network sooner, which I think would help. I want to talk a little bit about the changes they want to do with caller ID because I do want location information tied into that. We're gonna be talking a little bit about for the last few minutes here about RCD or rich call data, and then some of the considerations are making a caller ID. This is a very technical topic. We're not going to be able to completely dive into it here. This is going to be a big point of discussion along with all this at our Florida Summit. So if you're in attendance and you have not already signed up, I highly encourage you to sign up. We are going to have heavy representation from IMC. We're going to have heavy representation from IMC and Reach. We'll be talking about some of the things that these different groups are going to try to do to file comments and try to affect change. You want to be a part of it. We put a link to it there. For those of you that are on the call, we're offering a special discount. This is only going to be good until like the end of Thursday, but we're going to offer a special discount here on the call. I would also highly recommend that you reach out to one or both of the speakers after the call, have a quick conversation with them. They've got their own codes as well. You can stack those codes. So you want to maximize your savings. Just give Aaron and Joe 15 minutes of your time, and they can also give you an additional one if you want. But we'd love to see you there. We'd love to collaborate with you on it. So rich call data, just again, to try to keep this as simple and non-technical as possible, is a more advanced method of sending caller ID that is built on the STIR/SHAKEN framework. And you can use it for branded caller ID display. Now, I will tell you guys that today we do sell the legacy branded caller ID as it exists today. We're very familiar with what the RCD implementation through something called BCID or branded caller ID, the new standard is going to look like. I have to say I'm a fan. There are some challenges potentially with getting it up and running. There's going to be a little bit more collaboration between the business and their provider. But the trade-off is that as of right now, the price point looks like it's going to be much more tolerable by the industry. It is certainly, from what I can tell, much more secure. The current branded ecosystem, it's much harder to secure it. A lot of times it comes at a cost. But there have been some very visible manipulations of it where somebody's taken over somebody's caller ID and they've scammed some people out of money out of bank accounts and caused some big problems. So I'm not trying to trash the current caller ID standard at all, but I must say that the new standard does look like it's got a lot more to offer. And one of the considerations right now that's been talked about a lot throughout this document is, one, should this become the new standard? And two, should this become a requirement that everybody has to use the rich call data? To put this into perspective, the way that a company like us, and we're common with the market, price the current iteration of caller ID, your operating costs are going to go up about $5 per hour per agent. So, to put that in perspective, the labor market right now in South Africa is $5 an hour for an agent. That's what you're going to expect to be paying. So you're essentially doubling that operating cost, and that's just one aspect of your operating costs. So it's a heavy financial burden on a business. This one, I think, realistically, would probably be closer to the $2 range. It really depends on where some of the final prices land. Some of that is still being negotiated, but all that to be said, there is a talk about one, requiring this, and two, incorporating location information. I've seen maybe telling people that it's an A-level attestation, things of that nature in the discussion. And I want to put it to the speakers, in the last minutes here, what are your thoughts on where they're looking to take caller ID?
You want to go in? All
right. Joe, why don't you hop in?
Well, I guess I'll just piggyback on what I just said. That the commission's proposal is to have originating providers vet the caller ID and include that in this, the STIR/SHAKEN header information that's transmitted with every call that they give an A to. So, but they're also acknowledging that the A has been pretty unreliable, right? And you only get an A when the carrier has KYC'd the end user and has a verified relationship with the end user's telephone number. So if numerical is anywhere near correct, that 48% of A calls are misleading, we're asking the same group to do name verification when they don't seem to have done a great job at either KYC or telephone number verification. So, so to the extent to which it's going to produce any meaningful consumer benefits seems far from obvious. It's certainly going to be quite a bit more work for originating providers who are then going to burden the end users for all that information, which of course gets complicated in BPO type environments where it's not just one name. So it sounds great on a whiteboard, but practically speaking, I think there's going to be a lot of practical problems. And if Stir Shaken has been such a staggering success, I don't know why this is going to, actually help anybody either. So it's just going to, add barriers to entry to the telecom market, raise prices for callers. And nobody would shock to hear that I think it's not the best idea, and that people should be chiming in. And now the FCC seems to acknowledge that even ATIS, the standard setting body in IETF, like they acknowledge that RCD is just getting rolled out in its current iteration. Many carriers haven't implemented it. So unlike Stir Shaken, which was a fairly well developed regime that had a number of certificate authorities ready to step in and deploy, that doesn't seem to be the case with RCD. And I've got lots of clients that have differences of opinion about how it works, how difficult it is to integrate in different network segments. Never mind just the practical implication of, what level of verification do you really need to know that the name is right? Like that's not already being done as part of the KYC process. The FCC's had one singular KYC enforcement action, the Telnix case, which, of course is just frozen. And that was it. So there's very little guidance on what that's supposed to look like. And, if it's supposed to be now harder to open a phone account than it is a bank account, I mean, okay. Okay.
You're not wrong.
Yeah.
And I can't help but wonder, and I think they mentioned this at some point in the comments, or I think I saw something about this at some point, but if people are told, hey, A-level attestation, they're given some special symbol for that, and that's a requirement. Just given how limited, to put it nicely, the education has been around attestation and things like that, are we creating a scenario where a consumer can see that A-level attestation and now they go into that call with full trust, and it's a bad actor, both from what you were pointing out, Joe, but also about, I heard something, I think Stacy Graham from Cinch may have told me this the other day, or she said this in a webinar, I think. But one of the patterns that we're seeing right now from threat actors is they are compromising systems for good companies, and they're finding a backdoor, they're getting in, and they're using a legal system to make these calls and is calling who's on the list and trying to exploit it. So if that company has been able to obtain a attestation on every call, bad actors in, now they could do whatever they want to do. So I can't help but wonder if it doesn't create a false sense, or have the potential to create that false sense of security.
Right. Which is exactly the point about those check marks.
Right.
Right.
And if it incentivizes non-A-level at calls, if it would incentivize to try to go for
exactly.
B or C level.
Right.
Right. So now originating providers may say, you know what, why don't you go get your phone numbers from somebody else? That way I don't have to go through all this crazy business, and I'll give you a B, and then the terminating carrier can't block you because they don't have the information. And so right, Aaron and I just came up with that in 6 seconds. Like, is that really the regime we're going to do? Like, what?
And I think that is a good theme for a lot of the proposal. I mean, we discussed briefly a few days ago there are hundreds and hundreds of questions in this proposal that the FCC is seeking answers on. There's a lot to work through and a lot to develop. I mean, any which way you turn, you can run into issues like the few we've raised just talking out loud here. A lot to work through, a lot to sift through, and a lot of major implications.
I agree.
But they can go ahead and delete the stuff they're going to delete.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Exactly. Now, someone asked a question. I get a dozen calls a day for final expense or medical benefits, and we've all been there. With most calls coming from real individuals or local companies who come up on the caller ID. Won't this law just hurt legitimate businesses unless those loopholes are closed? I think so. The local caller ID is a very interesting one. There was a discussion somewhere in here, or a comment somewhere in here, about potentially making all foreign originating callers use a very specific area code. Everybody's relegated to that one area code, and that's the way people can know it's a foreign caller. When I was in that North American Numbering Oversight Committee, that was a proposal somebody had made, was all telemarketers, period, should be relegated to a certain area code or set of area codes so they could be identified. The reverse side of that is the localized caller ID, and that's why people were trying to fight against that. So reading this question, if the question is, should we close a loophole to where these bad actors can't use local caller IDs? The only way you're going to close that loophole is if you also stop the good companies from being able to use the local caller IDs, because it becomes very hard to tell the two apart without heavy KYC, which is something that every carrier is supposed to be doing. There is supposed to be a KYC obligation today. So I think that this does get to the heart of the issue, is that when a lot of rules come out, most of the time the good actors follow them. The bad guys keep doing what they're doing, because unless there's meaningful enforcement behind it, there's nothing that's going to happen. So this is where your comments, your feedbacks are going to be critical, because these things need to be highlighted to the commission. We don't have time to get into this. We could talk more about this in Florida, but there's several requests for comments or consideration that the FCC is saying, hey, these are 15 years old. We probably don't need to consider them anymore. I looked up a couple of them because I was attached to those comments being filed way back when they were filed, and I completely disagree. One of the comments on there is requiring carriers to provide feedback when a call is being labeled as spam or reported as spam. I think that there is still room to have that discussion. So likewise, I think having discussions around this and just making sure that legitimate businesses don't get caught up in the middle is a huge part of it. Maybe there needs to be a heavier focus on enforcement. Maybe some of it needs to shift from private right of action to federal enforcement with a budget behind it. We could speculate until the end of time, but unfortunately we are at time. So I'm going to open it up. I let Aaron go first. I'm going to let Joe go first this time. Any closing thoughts you want to leave us with, Joe?
No, I mean, I think you highlighted how important it is to let the FCC know how this will impact real businesses. So that's it.
Aaron, anything from you?
I mean, look, you got to commend the FCC for this proposal, trying to modernize, streamline rules. Lots to sort out. It's imperative that you read through this, really understand the granular details and the business impacts, and submit a comment.
Awesome. And, again, we are going to be talking about this heavily in Florida. This could have a huge impact on your business. So please be there. By then, we should have a lot of comments that have already been filed. So we should have an idea of where the industry is already pointing, both the people on the plaintiff side and the defendant side. So you could know what everybody's thinking, and that might help you with some of the comments that you might want to file. There should still be time probably about a week left to filing by the time our conference comes around. So please see us in Florida. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I encourage you to engage with and follow our speakers on LinkedIn. And again, thank you everybody for attending today, and I hope to see you in Florida. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Isaac.
You bet. Bye.